Madison Brooks stepped out of the town car just as the sun dipped below the skyline of Des Moines, Iowa. It had been a long week filled with back-to-back strategy calls, quarterly reviews, and last-minute shifts in a board agenda she hadn't planned on attending in person. But here she was, at the front entrance of the Brooks Grand Hotel, a place she had built from the ground up nearly a decade ago. She didn't want fanfare. No one needed to roll out a red carpet or bring her a glass of complimentary champagne. All she wanted was a quiet night in a warm bed and perhaps a hot espresso in the morning before facing a room full of executives. She hadn't packed much, just a canvas duffel over one shoulder, her tablet, and a pair of soft leather loafers that had molded to her feet over the years. As she stepped through the revolving glass doors, the familiar scent of polished wood and fresh eucalyptus greeted her. Madison smiled. She'd picked those details herself, wanting guests to feel like they were entering a sanctuary, not just another hotel off the interstate. Despite owning 17 properties across the U.S., from Baltimore to Phoenix, the Brooks Grand held a special place in her heart. It was her first. The one that had required every ounce of grit and every penny she could borrow at the time. It had become a symbol of what was possible when you dared to believe beyond what others assumed of you. Madison looked around the grand lobby, gleaming floors, custom lighting, a baby grand piano resting under a soft spotlight, and took a breath. She looked like any traveler arriving for the night. Her blouse, a muted dusty blue, was neatly pressed but unremarkable. Her hair, coiled back into a practical bun, framed a face both tired and determined. No assistant flanking her, no designer luggage announcing her status. She walked up to the front desk and offered a polite smile to the young woman stationed there. "Checking in," Madison said gently. "Name's Brooks." Madison Brooks. The receptionist, barely out of college by the look of her, typed for a moment, then frowned. "I don't see a reservation under that name," she said, her tone already cool. "We're fully booked tonight. Guests only." For a moment, Madison simply stood there. Not surprised. Not angry. Just disappointed. "I understand," she said, still calm. "But there's always a suite held for me. I own the hotel." There was a pause. A long one. The kind that stretches not just across a conversation, but across experience, decades of them. And in that pause, Madison could already sense the shift. She'd seen it before. Too many times. The receptionist didn't flinch. She offered a smile, polite but hollow, the kind given to customers you're about to turn away. Her fingers tapped a bit more on the keyboard, acrylic nails clicking like clockwork. "I'm sorry," she repeated. "We're completely at capacity tonight. You'll need a confirmed reservation." Madison Brooks didn't raise her voice. She didn't lean in or press her point. Instead, she stood tall and composed, her voice even and clear. "There's a permanent suite held under my name. Madison Brooks. I'm the owner of this property." The young woman blinked as if Madison had said she was the governor of Iowa. Then her lips curled into something between amusement and disbelief. "You own the Brooks Grand?" she said, skepticism dripping from each word. "Right. I'm going to call the manager." "Please do," Madison replied simply. Across the lobby, a couple in matching golf polos turned to look. A man near the fireplace raised an eyebrow, tilting his head just slightly in curiosity. Madison could feel it, the same weight she had felt too many times in her life. The look that said, "We know who must be lying. And we think we know why." Moments later, the assistant manager appeared from a side hallway. A thin man with a clipboard and a crooked tie. His name tag read Neil Dorrance. He approached with forced cheer. "Good evening," he said, glancing briefly at Madison before turning to the receptionist. "Is there a problem?" "She claims to own the hotel," the receptionist announced, just a touch too loudly. Neil hesitated. "I don't claim," Madison said calmly. "I do. My name is Madison Brooks. It's on the quarterly reports. On the deed. On the bronze plaque behind your desk." Neil turned to look. The plaque was there. Right above the receptionist's shoulder, Brooks Grand, a Brooks hospitality property. The moment stretched. Neil shifted uncomfortably. "Just one moment, please," he muttered, already turning toward a back office, speaking quietly into a walkie-talkie clipped to his belt. And then, just like that, security arrived. Not in a rush, not with hands on their belts, but they came. One stood by the elevators. Another took position near the lobby coffee bar. The message was clear. They didn't know who she was, but they knew what they thought she wasn't. Madison didn't react. Not outwardly. But deep inside, she felt the quiet burn, one she had known since she was a young woman walking into boardrooms and being mistaken for a secretary. She could have shown her ID, pulled up emails, even scrolled to photos of the ribbon cutting from 6 years ago. But she didn't. Instead, she stepped back from the desk, pulled out her phone, and made a single call. It lasted just 26 seconds. Then, she waited. Because this wasn't about a room anymore. It was about something deeper, something that had followed her all her life, no matter how high she rose. Madison stood near the marble pillar in the corner of the lobby, her phone now tucked quietly back into her purse. She didn't fidget. She didn't pace. She didn't pull out a camera to record the scene like so many others might have. Instead, she simply waited, with the calm patience of someone who had nothing to prove, only something to witness. The energy in the lobby had shifted. The receptionist returned to her keyboard, tapping as if the screen might magically change its mind. Neil hadn't reappeared yet. Security remained in place, eyes forward, arms crossed. And Madison? She stayed where she was, unbothered on the outside, a storm brewing gently underneath. All around her, the hush grew louder. 3 women seated near the window began whispering behind their hands. A young man with a laptop, pretending not to watch, had clearly stopped working. Even the doorman had paused his welcome routine. Madison saw the moment it happened, the moment when the receptionist, likely curious or nervous, checked her phone under the desk. A quick search. Probably typing Madison Brooks. Likely expecting nothing. But what she found was everything. Because there it was, profile pieces in Forbes, photos from the hotel's groundbreaking ceremony, interviews about Brooks Hospitality's founding mission, luxury with dignity, access without arrogance. And maybe, just maybe, she saw the video clip from last fall, when Madison had spoken at the National Small Business Conference and brought a ballroom full of executives to their feet. Yet none of that had been obvious when she walked in. That was the part that always stung the most. Not the denial, but the assumption. That she didn't belong. That she was probably mistaken. That someone like her, black, unaccompanied, casually dressed, couldn't possibly be the name etched on the very foundation of this building. And sadly, it wasn't new. Madison's mind drifted for a moment to a hotel lobby in Milwaukee, years ago. She was 28 then, fresh into her role as VP, wearing a suit too big for her and heels that blistered her feet. She'd been followed around the lobby by security until the CFO finally came down to meet her. She hadn't forgotten that night. Nor the dozens that came after it. She inhaled deeply, steady and slow. The familiar ache of being underestimated was one she had carried like a silent passenger for most of her adult life. But not tonight. Tonight was different. She didn't need to shout. She didn't need to argue. She had made the call. And now, the wheels were turning. Madison wasn't just waiting for a room. She was waiting for recognition. Not because of power or money, but because she had earned it, and because no one should have to prove their worth just to be treated like they matter. The soft ding of the elevator echoed across the lobby like a bell signaling a shift in power. Two men stepped out, both walking with a kind of urgency that only came when something had gone very wrong. Madison recognized them instantly. One wore a gray tailored suit, clipboard in hand, the other, a Navy company fleece zipped up to his chin. They weren't bellhops. They weren't concierge. They were the cavalry. Brent Kessler, regional vice president, and Carlos Reno, district manager. They crossed the marble floor without stopping, ignoring Neil, who had just returned from the back hallway looking pale and uneasy. Brent walked straight up to Madison with a look that balanced apology and dread. "Miss Brooks," he said, voice brisk, but respectful. "We are so sorry. I just got the call." Carlos followed, slightly breathless. "We're correcting this immediately." Neil started to speak, something about confusion, a mix-up, maybe even protocol, but Brent silenced him with a look sharp enough to cut steel. "No excuses tonight." The receptionist had gone quiet, frozen behind the desk. Her phone lay face down now, her hands no longer tapping. Madison caught the subtle change in her posture, shoulders rounded, breathing shallow. She had realized, finally, who she had turned away. Carlos turned toward his tablet. "Suite 1202 has been cleared. Your driver has been rerouted and will be ready at 7 a.m. espresso and fruit tray as usual." He looked up carefully. "We'll have the full hospitality protocol in place." Madison gave the faintest smile, appreciative but guarded. "Thank you," she said softly. But she wasn't done watching. What she wanted now was something far deeper than an upgraded room. She wanted to see what happened next, after the truth was known. Because it was one thing to be dismissed by someone who didn't know your name. It was another to be dismissed even when they did. Carlos pulled Neil aside. His voice lowered, but the sharpness remained. Brent was already on the phone again, this time muttering clipped phrases about HR and staff conduct reports. The tension that had once clung to Madison had now dispersed, and settled firmly on the shoulders of the staff around her. You could feel it in the stillness. A kind of reckoning in motion. She didn't gloat. There were no "I told you so" glances. She simply walked back to the front desk, her heels soft against the tile, and placed her phone down calmly. "I'll take the 12th floor suite," she said. "Same setup. And please send someone up to confirm it's clean." Brent flipped his clipboard. "Already done. 2 key cards. Incident report in progress. And the rest? We've issued a property-wide notification. Corporate audit team is on standby. Staff recertification begins tonight." Madison nodded once. "Good. Not out of revenge, but because respect, once denied, must be rebuilt with action." At precisely 6:30 a.m., Madison Brooks stepped into the lobby of the Brooks Grand Hotel, not as a weary traveler, but as the CEO. Her deep charcoal suit was sharply pressed, paired with a crisp ivory blouse. Each click of her modest, 2-inch heels echoed across the polished floor, not loud, but unmistakable. She carried herself with the quiet certainty of a woman who had worked too hard, for too long, to ever question her right to be here. The lobby was stirring now with early checkouts, business travelers grabbing coffee, and luggage wheels humming against the tile. But the mood shifted the moment she appeared. Conversations paused. Eyes followed. Even the barista at the corner kiosk froze mid-pour. Waiting by the fireplace were Brent and Carlos, each holding a folder and a paper cup of coffee. Neither had been touched. Their suits looked slept in. Their faces were drawn. Madison offered a small nod and walked past them, straight into the executive conference room tucked just behind the concierge desk. They followed without a word. Inside, the room was cool and quiet. Neil Doran sat stiffly in a chair, eyes on the table. Kayla Mendez, the receptionist from the night before, looked even younger in the morning light, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. A third woman, neatly dressed in gray, introduced herself as Marta Green, HR from corporate. Her notepad was already open. Madison didn't sit. She stood at the head of the table, arms folded, surveying the room not with anger, but with measured focus. No one spoke at first. The silence was thick. Then she broke it. Would someone like to explain what happened last night from your perspective? Kayla looked down. Neil cleared his throat but said nothing. Finally, Kayla whispered, "I just didn't think she was, I didn't expect." Her voice trailed off. "You didn't expect someone like me to own the building," Madison finished for her. Her tone wasn't sharp, but steady. Controlled. Kayla nodded, eyes filled with regret. "Was I rude to you?" Madison asked. Kayla shook her head. "No, ma'am." "Did I raise my voice?" "No." "Did I threaten anyone?" "No." Madison took a breath and turned to Marta. "I'm not here for a firing squad," she said firmly. "But I am here for accountability." Carlos spoke next. "We're issuing a formal write-up. Kayla will be removed from the front desk until retrained. Neil is going under review." Madison nodded. Then she Saturday, "Kayla, how long have you worked here?" 4 months. "And in that time, did you ever think about who built this place?" Kayla hesitated. "I just assumed it was owned by some corporation. A group of investors." "I built it," Madison said quietly. "And 16 others across the country. Because I was tired of being treated like I didn't belong." Her voice softened, but the weight in her words stayed. "And last night, in a building with my name on it, I was still invisible." Later that morning, after the lobby had calmed from its early rush, Madison Brooks found herself standing quietly just outside the staff lounge. She wasn't there for a disciplinary follow-up or a corporate directive. This meeting was different, personal. It wasn't scheduled, and no one had sent for Kayla. Madison came on her own. Inside the lounge, the buzz of a vending machine filled the stillness. Kayla Mendez sat alone at a small table, a half-eaten blueberry muffin on a napkin and a styrofoam cup of lukewarm coffee by her side. Her phone sat face down. She looked like she hadn't slept. Madison gently stepped in, not with authority, but with intention. Kayla startled, nearly knocking over her drink. "Relax," Madison said, pulling out the chair across from her. "I just want to talk." Kayla nodded, shoulders tight. "Yes, ma'am." "Drop the ma'am," Madison replied with a small smile. "This isn't a hearing." The silence between them lasted a few beats. Comfortable wasn't the right word, necessary was. It gave the conversation room to breathe. Madison leaned back slightly. "Have you ever worked in a place where you felt small?" Kayla blinked. "Yeah. Most of the time, honestly." "Tell me." Kayla hesitated, then shrugged. I worked at a diner off I-80 for a year. Had to wear one of those paper hats. The cooks yelled every shift. Most customers didn't tip, and some just called me kid, even though I was 27. Madison nodded. So you know what it feels like to be overlooked? Yes. Then help me understand, Madison said gently. How you looked me in the eye last night and decided I didn't belong here. Kayla's eyes welled slightly. I don't know, she whispered. I didn't mean to. When you walked in, I thought you were maybe lost or waiting on someone. You didn't look like. She stopped herself. Madison didn't flinch. Didn't look like what? Kayla looked away. Like the kind of person who owns a hotel. And there it was. Madison nodded slowly. That picture in your head? It's not just yours. It lives in a lot of people. Older, male, white, wearing a $5,000 suit and Rolex. It's what most of us have been conditioned to expect. She paused. But that picture, she continued, affects how we treat people. Who we believe. Who we ignore. Kayla looked down. I'm sorry. I really am. I know it's not enough, but I am. I don't need an apology, Madison said. I need you to see me. Not as your boss. Not as a headline. As a person. Kayla nodded, quietly taking it in. I was you once, Madison added. I answered phones. Got mistaken for housekeeping. Had to prove I deserved to be in the room. Every single time. She stood, ready to leave. I don't expect perfection. Just awareness. Treat every guest like they matter, because they do. As Madison stepped away, something inside her lightened. The message had finally landed, in the one place that mattered most. By mid-morning, the rhythm of the Brooks Grand Hotel had returned, at least on the surface. Guests wheeled their carry-ons across the lobby floor, fresh coffee brewed behind the cafe bar, and a small family asked the concierge for directions to the local zoo. But behind the scenes, something had shifted. Inside the management office, Brent Kessler stood near the window, arms crossed, watching the valet rotate cars out front. Carlos Reno sat at the small conference table, typing an internal memo with focused intensity. Marta Green, the HR representative, was quietly reviewing updated onboarding materials on her tablet, her reading glasses perched at the edge of her nose. At the center of it all sat Madison Brooks, sleeves rolled back, reading a stack of personnel files marked for evaluation. Her expression wasn't angry, it was exact. She wasn't there to punish. I'm not here for retribution, she said aloud, her voice steady. I'm here to prevent repetition. Carlos looked up. We're adjusting the interview process for front desk hires, he reported. Adding behavioral screening for empathy and bias detection. Good, Madison replied. She tapped her pen once, then pointed to the memo on the desk. And put me on the random rotation. Starting next quarter. Brent blinked. You mean to visit properties anonymously? Not secretly, she corrected. Just quietly. Until I'm not. Carlos gave a small grin. That'll make a lot of managers nervous. Good, she said. Let them sit with that. To Madison, true leadership didn't come with advanced notice. Respect wasn't about titles or lanyards, it was about how people acted when they thought no one was watching. She stood and gathered the files into a neat folder. Have the new training go live by next Friday. No empty corporate scripts. I want real stories, real experiences from real guests. And I want our staff reading them. Brent nodded. "We'll get it done." Madison stepped out of the office and returned to the lobby. The reception area had a new face at the desk, a young man with a warm smile and steady eyes. He greeted her respectfully, no hesitation in his voice, no assumptions in his tone. She nodded in return. Everything appeared normal. But she could feel it, the small cracks forming in old habits, the subtle rewiring of what had once been automatic. That's how real change happens, she thought. Not in headlines or PR campaigns, but in quiet corrections, repeated until they stick. She turned toward the elevator to collect her things. Her flight wouldn't leave for hours, but the work, the real work, had already begun. And for the first time in a long time, she felt something different blooming beneath the surface. Not just reaction. Redirection. Back in Suite 1202, the smell of lemon and fresh linens lingered in the air. Madison's overnight bag was zipped and ready on the luggage rack. Her laptop was closed, charger coiled neatly beside it. Everything was in order, except for one small, folded note left on the nightstand. She opened it slowly. "Miss Brooks. Thank you for your grace. I'll be better. Kayla." It was written on a plain notepad, no envelope, no hotel letterhead. Just honest handwriting on lined paper, carefully printed, clearly meant. Madison folded it once, tucked it into her purse, and smiled. It wasn't corporate. It wasn't rehearsed. But it meant more than any formal apology ever could. Downstairs, the doorman from the night before was waiting, posture upright, hand on the polished brass handle. "Safe travels, Miss Brooks," he said, his voice warm. "We hope to see you again soon." "You will," Madison replied with quiet assurance. The town car eased away from the curb, gliding smoothly down Grand Avenue. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. What she left behind wasn't just policy change or staff memos, it was a shift in the way people saw, listened, and acted. In the back seat, she rested one hand on her purse and the other on her lap. The folded note pressed lightly against her palm. The driver said nothing, and Madison welcomed the silence. No radio. No idle chatter. Just the soft hum of tires on pavement and the steady rhythm of passing street signs. As they passed rows of brick buildings, faded mechanic shops, and mom-and-pop diners, she reflected, not just on last night, but on the years that brought her here. Years of working graveyard shifts in stiff uniforms. Of being called honey and sweetheart while balancing the books at 2 a.m. Of pushing through doors she hadn't been invited to open. She had built 17 properties. Created hundreds of jobs. Delivered thousands of memorable stays. But still, she had to prove, over and over again, that she belonged. That was the exhausting part, not the work, but the assumptions. The constant recalibration of how others saw her, and how often they didn't. And yet, she wasn't bitter. That's what people often misunderstood about women like her, especially women of color who had clawed their way up in industries built to keep them out. She didn't carry bitterness. She carried memory. And memory, when used right, doesn't harden you. It grounds you. As the car turned onto the highway ramp toward the airport, she looked ahead, not just at the road, but at what came next. She thought of the countless people like her, those who had been dismissed, doubted, made to feel invisible. And to them, whether they were watching or not, she offered one final truth. You don't have to shout to be heard. You just have to know who you are. And walk like the door was always yours. The story of Madison Brooks reminds us that no matter how far we've come or how much we've achieved, the world can still be slow to see our worth, especially if we don't fit the picture others expect. But that's where the real lesson lies. Our dignity isn't tied to how others treat us, but how we choose to carry ourselves. Madison didn't raise her voice, didn't demand attention. She stood in her truth and let her presence speak louder than any confrontation ever could. That's a powerful reminder, especially for those of us who've lived long enough to know how often respect is based on assumptions rather than substance. For older adults, many of whom have experienced their own moments of being overlooked, underestimated, or forgotten, this story hits home. It calls us to remember the value of grace under pressure, of leading by example, and of turning frustration into opportunity. Whether you're walking into a room where people don't know your name or helping younger generations understand what resilience looks like, the message is the same. You don't have to shout to be heard. You just have to know who you are. Madison teaches us that quiet strength can be revolutionary. She didn't seek revenge, she sought change. And that's something each of us can take with us, whether we're running a company, raising a family, or simply showing up with integrity every day. In a world full of noise, her story is a gentle but firm reminder: walk with dignity, lead with heart, and never let anyone else define your value.